Have you ever wondered what it would be like to observe a wild horse roundup? If so, this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. For the past 3 weeks, the Bureau of Land Management, with the Coutures as the contractor supplying helicopters, pilots, wranglers, panels, and transport, have been rounding up and removing wild horses from the Northlander complex in Wyoming. The goal for removal for this first year in a 10-year plan was to remove 2,755 wild horses, which is 90% of the total estimated population, and then to return 40 horses to the complex, 20 stallions, and 20 mares that are treated with Gonacon. This roundup started July 1st and will likely wrap up in the next couple of days as they are close to their goal for removal, and they are just small scattered families left. As of today, July 22nd, 2,576 wild horses have been rounded up and 16 have died. What is it like observing a wild horse roundup? What the BLM, who is fond of their euphemisms, now calls drive trapping? This was my 20th roundup as an observer. The very first thing that someone who wants to observe has to do is to contact the field office in charge of the roundup. In this case, the Lander, Wyoming field office, or the public affairs person for the area, and then request to be put on the observation list. Then you'll get emails from the BLM public affairs person, who is in charge, letting you know the start date, as well as once the roundup gets going, the time and place that you need to meet in order to be escorted out to the trap observation site for the day. You can also ask them where the closest town to stay in would be. In this case, we received emails between 7 and 8 p.m. each night about when and where to meet the next day. It's usually in a easily found public area, like a BLM office, or in this case, the Riverton Fairgrounds, or even a county road crossroads. Everyone has to have their own vehicle, bring their own water and food, and should have a 4-wheel drive vehicle with a full-size spare. You have to be prepared to spend the whole day out there because when the contractor is capturing or loading or hauling horses out, they don't want the public in the way or interfering. The meetup is usually very early in the morning. Times for this roundup ranged mostly from 5:30 a.m. until 6:30 a.m. The time to drive out was from 1 hour to 1.5 hours from the meetup point to the observation site. It's always early, but in this case, since the roundup was in July, it was essential that it be early because of the heat. This is the first roundup in Wyoming in the 20 years I have been observing that was scheduled for July. Usually, Wyoming roundups start in October or later. And this was a really terrible scheduling problem because instead of being after most of the mares had foaled, foaling was still going strong. There were lots of little babies and pregnant mares that should never have been made to run from a helicopter. Since 2010, BLM has been putting observers further and further away from the trap itself, making viewing what's going on very difficult, and certainly viewing and observing in any sort of meaningful fashion impossible. There will often be a hill in the way, or in this case, we were placed 1.6 miles from the trap. So even with binoculars or my very long 800 lens, it is extremely difficult to see what's going on. What is the trap? It is several panels set up and linked with other panels and gates that can be closed to separate the horses and keep them in as soon as the helicopter drives them in. There are long panels of jute strung on T-posts that serve as a funnel outside the trap to channel the horses in. Once they bring the horses in, they can separate the stallions from the mares and the mares from the foals. The Coutures like to use 2 helicopters during a roundup, which allows them to stop horses from evading the path the pilot wants them to take. They have a lot of experience doing this, so they know how close to be to the horses in order to keep them together and not pressure them so much that they panic and flee in different directions. But sometimes the horses refuse to enter the trap. Occasionally, stallions even face the helicopter in defiance, refusing to move. The pilots are not supposed to push the horses faster than the slowest member of a family or a group can keep up, like an older horse or like a foal. But it happens time and time again that a foal is not able to keep up or is in distress, and the wranglers get on their horses and go rope the foal or get on either side and try to get it to come into the trap. Watching foals be roped is very distressing. They are frightened and alone, and they have no idea what's going on, and they can fight and even get flipped over. Sometimes there may be something physically wrong with the horse that can't make it to the trap, like an injured leg, or colic, or sheer exhaustion, and they euthanize them on the spot. One of the causes of death, cited especially for foals, is capture myopathy. This occurs when animals overexert themselves, struggling in a trap, for example, so much that physiological imbalances develop and result in severe muscle damage. Hotter temperatures increase the risk of animals suffering from capture myopathy. Death can occur in a matter of minutes. This is yet another reason why these roundups should not be conducted in the middle of summer with high heat. The whole premise behind a helicopter roundup is to scare prey animals, horses, into running from a terrifying thing, a helicopter chasing them. This is never something that is done to domestic horses. When the BLM started doing roundups of wild horses in 1969, they originally used wranglers on horseback to chase wild horses into a trap. The chase could be hours long, and the Coutures claim that this is much more humane to use helicopters. Well, it is certainly faster, especially using 2 helicopters. But this is not a humane practice. There are broken necks from horses slamming into a panel in the trap, broken legs from trying to jump over a panel, head injuries from running into panels. Foals run until their hooves fall off. Nothing about this is humane. There are always deaths. Regardless if they are deemed by the BLM to be pre-existing or acute injuries, they are deaths that would not have happened without the roundup. When the BLM starts talking about what is an acceptable amount of deaths, I feel like I want to vomit. None of these deaths are acceptable. The horses are not supposed to have run more than 10 miles to the trap, but horses don't travel in straight lines. And especially if they're fighting the helicopter, working hard to escape, they will be traveling more distance, and this is especially when foals get left behind. When I'm observing this, it is a helpless feeling. I cannot get them to stop the roundup. I don't have any say in what happens. I can watch in the location I am told to be by the BLM along with other members of the public, with public affairs staff and at least 1 BLM ranger. I can take photographs or video. I can stand for and with the horses and bear witness to what is happening to them. I can report violations in procedure, like when horses are run into a barbed wire fence or driven for over an hour in the heat, and ask questions about what happened to a foal or to a stallion or to a mare. After the helicopters are done for the day, there is usually the opportunity to go to temporary holding. These holding pens are usually on either the herd management area or on private land, fairly central to where the captures are taking place, and it's where the horses are taken by horse trailer or semi from the trap to be held until they are shipped to a short-term holding facility. In this case, the short-term holding facility is the private facility in Wheatland, Wyoming, that can house up to 3,500 wild horses. This is where the horses from the Northlander complex are being shipped to. Temporary holding is pens set up where the contractor and BLM staff can sort and hold the horses. The foals are separated from the mares on the trailer ride there to prevent injury, then hopefully, but not always, reunited with their mothers once they arrive. This is a trailer driving away with a foal in it separated from its mother. They have black mesh wrapped around the outer panels of the pens, ostensibly to keep the horses from being scared by what they see outside, but I think it's mostly to keep us from being able to really see the horses properly. During this roundup, we were told that if the horses arrived at temporary holding later than 3:30 p.m., we would not get to view them. If it was earlier, we had to wait at the observation site until we were allowed to go. Sometimes we waited for several hours. During this roundup, we were told that the rancher whose property temporary holding was on did not want members of the public there at all, so a huge concession by him was made, but we had to be in and out and run around the temporary holding as fast as possible. So instead of the walk around while we were asking questions of the wild horse lead, we were able to ask questions first, then we were literally run around the pens. If I stopped to take a photo, I was yelled at by the ranger, or the lead, and threatened to be thrown out. We were in and out in 10 minutes, and I had never been rushed like that before. I was told this was not a photo opportunity. Well, that may be true, but it really wasn't even an opportunity to assess the conditions of the horses either, because it was so rushed, and we could barely see them. After the ridiculous visit to temporary holding, we were released for the day. Usually they were done before noon, but I was there on the longest, hottest day of the roundup when we were there from 7 to 3:30 p.m., and it was 92 degrees when we left. There are no porta potties out there. Sometimes I had to hike a long way to get out of the view of everyone and find a bush to pee behind. So why observe? Because the contractors are more careful with the horses when members of the public are there. So are BLM staff. There are less injuries and deaths. Sometimes, if they are violating their own rules, you can get a change implemented to help the horses. And you can get the word out about how this is being done and why it is so wrong. Because removing wild horses from the lands that they call home and from their families and their freedom is never the solution. Our wild horses need to be managed on our public lands where they belong. And I will keep observing and standing for them until this barbaric and inhumane practice is abolished. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. Make sure that you sign up for my newsletter on www.wildhoofbeats.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.